anybody wants to chat, I'll chat.
Well, that was a lot.
Yes. Sorry. I was like, I can't even, it's so huge.
Luckily, I'm working on a couple pieces about that. So like that, and that's been something I've been thinking on for like several years, and how to condense it to a few sentences. And I was just like, where do you even start? You know, like I'm going to say the wrong thing somewhere in here, and like it's hard because in some ways, like I mean, you know this, Katrina, like Black culture doesn't really label things in that way. So I was like, I don't want to say, like, I think people will misunderstand what I mean by uh, uh, like when I said like Black women versus Black men. And I'm like, it's not really what I mean, but there's no other word for that like categorization that happens. Because it's not really about that. It's more like masculinity and femininity, but it's not even that. Because like Prince wore heels, but was still considered a man, and then like, but was definitely in like the masculine role, position, whatever that is. But then like, there's this famous actress. All I remember is she wore the like cape with all the rainbow flag behind her. She's great. It starts with an L, if anybody knows.
Randy, do you know?
Lena Reed.
Yes.
Lena Waite.
And she wears like nice suits and everything, but definitely still falls in the like woman, feminine, whatever that role category should be called, but we don't have a name for. And I like kind of comparing those two images when people are like, what do you mean by that? And it's like, well, if you just say masculine and feminine, like you could reverse those, but role wise, they're definitely in their separate like roles.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this now, and I was sort of like kind of at a loss. That's why I'm like, I'm leaving Gray hanging. I'm so sorry. But there is something you have to understand about what culture. There's just an acceptance that is there. Like when I talked about earlier about showing up as you, we kind of just expect you to show up as you. And there's just a matter of factness about, okay, this is how you're showing up. I'm going to navigate it this way. It's sort of been my experience is that, like you're saying, it's not labeling, like, I don't need to label you as this, or that, or this. It's just, as you show up, okay, this is what I got to deal with. This is the role, like you said, the role in society. This is the role that you're playing in this space. This is the role that you're playing in this relationship. And it just kind of is. It's not something we need to talk about, because why do we need to talk about it? Because, I don't know, like it feels like it's an additional element to an already cumbersome mental space and life to then categorize people. Why don't I just accept you as you are and just go about my business, and then know that, like, if I'm in, like you said, if I'm in this space, this is how I act. If I'm in this space, this is how I act. And then, you know, and you kind of just know the rules of that. And like, you just kind of know it because you kind of grew up with it, that respect is number one. Respect the people around you. And also there is this element of constantly pushing for you to just be you, and we can go about our business.
Yeah, I think one of the things I didn't really touch on, but because how it's just like how is, I know that in some people's minds they're like, but I know that Black culture is homophobic and sexist. And I was like, not any more so than white culture. Like, more outspoken in some spaces, but that's just because the culture is more outspoken. But like, there's it's in both sides, and like in some ways I actually feel significantly more at ease in Black spaces as a like as what at least I feel a visible trans person than I do in white spaces. And some of that is because of like the direction, the categorization I'm switching over to is a little more accepted and yada yada. But like I know that was a thought that was going through people's heads, and I wanted to address it, but I was like, This is already too much.
Yeah, we can have all kinds of what is contributing to, right? And then all the context that needs to go along with that, and then the history that needs to go along with that, for all of us just to get on the same page.
Yeah, because you have to like tie in the matriarchal thing and like how it's generally Black women / whoever falls into that like role category tend to be more openly accepting because of white supremacy messing with the other categories, worth and value, and it's just like it's a lot.
Yeah.
So I was like, I can't say that in like 3 minutes, but I'm saying it to you now because I'm still thinking about it. Does age play into this at all? I would say so, but I think it plays into it mostly in the same way that one, age plays into any gender discussions or like societal norm discussions, but then also like things are bad now, but things were worse then. So you have to play the game more and more as you go older in generations. So there tends to be more openness to fucking the rules and the ideas of respectability in the eyes of white people in the older generations than there are in the younger generations. And like it's very much tied to that. So yeah, like there's a lot of thought there.
And then now, I mean, even age coming into play in dance, right? You know, we look to our elders with respect and to some level of mentorship, right? And as we are changing in the times that we are, of everybody, you know, healing from their own traumas and the way they've lived. I mean, that's, again, it's a slightly different cultural difference, that eldership plays a very significant role in Black culture and even in the dance world, that you always pay homage to those that came before you. And how do you bring that in even how do you show up even when you disagree with what your elders are saying. So there's a lot of, even within this, that I can go in 500 different directions, and I will try to keep it that. However, just know that yes, age plays a thing in what gets passed down and what gets, well, just rules, period.
Yeah, and I also think that like the age plays a thing in a way that also, like, when I feel disrespected in my gender identity by elder white people, I know it's coming from a very different place than when I get misgendered by older white people or Black people, because usually it's a not understanding, it's a respectability politics thing, which is important in like how they stay alive, and also on some level, I know that they're not judging me. Like, they might not get it, but they're also like, yeah, you do you. Like, I don't get it, but you know, be you. Like, you gotta be you. You can't be anything else. And that duality, oh, it's so pretty. I think that duality is really important, and that like the age to most like social movements that are happening in the Black community, but it's really obvious and clear in like the LGBT movement in the Black community is why that like that interplay of like, and then there's religion, and then like
I was just about to say, because I'm thinking of my grandma who like hardcore religious. One of my cousins is gay, and I remember she having a sit down with him, coming from a religious background, of his choices, and this is the conversation between them. This is not my values, like, but at the same time, he is her grandson and she loves him dearly, and it's like she's stepping in this role of, I'm passing down my beliefs and this is what I believe, but at the end of the day, I'm still going to love you and I'm still going to wish you well, and I'm going to still accept you, right? even though,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's complicated is a summary of all of that. And with that note, whomever is heading up this section of time is going to unmute themselves in 3, 2, 1.
And that would be me. Thank you, Gray. All right, so this is our follow roundtable. I missed part of the conversation between Katrina and Gray, but it certainly migrated a lot between when I left and when I came back. So maybe some of those topics will come back in. It got recorded, so who knows? We'll maybe hear about this more later anyway. So the idea for this is going to be a little less formal feeling, I think, than the panel. And we're just going to talk about how some of these topics that we've been talking about with the lead follow gap relate to the follow role specifically. So I'm going to let everybody go around and sort of reintroduce themselves, since we may have some new folks on, and then sort of take it away. I have a couple of questions from the original panel that I'll probably throw out there at some point if they don't come up, and I will be monitoring the chat. But otherwise, this is kind of what you guys want to talk about. Katrina, do you want to reintroduce yourself to start us off?
Hi, everybody. I'm Katrina Rogers. Pronoun she, her, hers. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm in this roundtable because I'm primarily a follow.
Hi, I'm Jill Grant. I'm in Halifax in Canada, and I started out as a follow. I do lead as well, and I'm interested in this panel because I think there's a lot to be said about what the factors are behind this kind of a gap that we are experiencing, and want to hear more about what other people think about it too.
Hi, I'm Dan Repsch. I'm really happy to be here. Let's see, I started off, I've been pretty much leading and following since I started dancing, which, geez, I don't even know where do there's going to be a lot to talk about with all this, but I've done most of my classes as a lead, and at this point I'm kind of like 60% leading, 40% following, but I'm here in this panel. I'm kind of representing the lead side of things, I guess, a bit here. So I think that's all for me.
And then my name is Gray Armstrong. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently in Huntsville, Alabama, and I lead and follow pretty often, both, but I consider myself to be a primary follow because the definition I use of that is if I were to go to a weekend and not get any of it, would I leave disappointed? And I can live without leading, I can live without switching. I would be disappointed if I didn't follow at all throughout a weekend. Yeah.
I really like that definition because I lead as well, but I would be really sad if I didn't get a chance to really follow. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll start the conversation with a question that I got during the panel for Gray and Katrina. And it's sort of and I think this was during sort of the conversation of like how you would define when you started to dance and all that, that section is how you would define the lead and the follow role in blues dancing.
Can I start this? One of the things that I think it's worth discussing is those labels themselves, because they imply a power dynamic in the dance that can be somewhat problematic. You know, it implies that the leader is somehow in charge and the follower is in a lesser role. And Gray raised this in the earlier discussion too about, you know, whether we, in order to address that, we've kind of gone the other direction in recent times. But I think trying to address that power dynamic and figure out what causes it has made me think that perhaps it has to do with the way that we learn and teach following and leading as skills. Because in order to be a good follower, you have to be able to adapt. You have to learn a lot of techniques to be able to respond effectively to what someone else is asking you to do. Whereas I think that as leaders, often people think of it more as a sequence of moves. So I need to do this, I need to do that. And even though the teaching may talk about technique, people who are learning to lead may think about it more as developing a repertoire of sequence of things that they do. And so I think because followers are learning that technique of how to respond when they feel something, they may be developing skills, different kinds of skills, and developing skills that are more translatable to expertise than a sequence of moves.
I want to like echo that a lot because and that's something that like was a blind spot for me a little bit, because I remember like the moment when I started like teaching more in French, and like hearing the word for lead and follow in French didn't, like when I hear lead and follow in English, I associate it with like people versus the word lead and the word follow. But then when I started like hearing it in French and I didn't have those pre-associations with it, I was like, oh yeah, there totally does sound like there's a power dynamic here, and it actually started to feel like a little strange to use those words a bit. Which is not, yeah, which is just to say, like, I realized that there was something that I hadn't realized before. And I agree in the sense of like a power dynamic, because even in the past, I know this has been changing, but I feel like even in the past, when we say like Joe was saying, like follows have to be adaptable, and the leads have to make space for the follow, things like that. That's all very lead centric, right? It's like leads have all the power, and they have to give up some power so that the follows can be themselves at some point. And I feel like I agree. I feel like there's a little bit of an issue with how that's being taught. And I feel like if we can get rid of that power dynamic and like, I don't know, teach us so that it's more like two individuals, not even having a conversation, but like two individuals just sort of like melting together, right? Because rather than like, sometimes there is that give and take, but sometimes it's just two intentions just melding into each other kind of thing.
So I wanted to clarify a little bit of like my coming into sort of the question. When I first came into dancing, I kind of came up sort of like the club route, and where there is partnership in dance, not in the way that we exhibit partnership, but I've always experienced that as kind of what Dan is saying, like two people coming with ideas and finding a way to like meld together. That is always has been my experience until I came into Blues and Lindy, where we started to really talk about the lead follow roles. And in time, you know, obviously like understanding what are those roles in the way that we dance. But if I bring it back into sort of a blackness about it, of each person showing up as them and bringing their movements into the dance and finding a way to blend it, has a lot to do with each person listening to each other and moving in a way that makes sense. I don't know that I'm kind of working through my definitions of that in terms of, I look at like, what is the role of the lead and what's the role of the follow in that sort of vacuum, you know, that I would sort of keep that as, well, the role of the lead is to share vision, right? And share an idea of what sort of the overarching shape of that, and inviting other people into that space, or inviting the partner into that space, but still sharing ideas, not as a power dynamic. I really try to remove myself from the feeling of that it's a power dynamic. And I would say only a brief part of me would I'd say that like the lead dictates, right? And I really I've experienced other dances where that feels like that's the role of the lead, and I don't feel like that's the role in blues, or at least my experience, right? And my cumulative experience of that, as much as we're dancing together and this is how we dance together in their respective roles. And that wasn't a very clear definition at all, and I recognize that.
So I think I have a very different perspective than you all do. So keep in mind this fact. We didn't used to call lead and follow. It was called man and woman. And that was the expectations. And so we're actually reading onto it our own concepts of power and gender dynamics in some ways. Like the choices of leaders and followers was probably intentional by whoever's decided that that was what they were saying. It's another way of saying, for lack of a better way of putting it, man and woman. And those expectations get carried through into our dancing today. But for me, at least, when I hear man and I hear woman, I don't hear this is the powerful person and this is the powerful person. I hear this is the powerful person and this is a supportive person, because I grew up in a matriarchy. Like the woman, the follow role, that role in society is the more powerful. It may not look the way that being powerful in white society looks like, but for me, it is a powerful role. And I always say that, the followers actually have slightly more power than the leader does in a Black framework of thought. So when I hear leader and follower, I have a very different reaction to it. Like, I don't hear that standard, or the like lead means you're powerful. Like, there is a lot of power in being willing to follow and being supported in following. And like, it's just a very different perspective on it. So for me, I see you're both dancers and you both have a distinct role. There's a distinct thing you are coming together to do. You are peanut butter and you are jelly. Jelly can't be peanut butter can't be jelly. Now you can mix the two and you can have peanut butter jelly, and that's great and delicious and it's its own thing. But like, they are separate roles that when coming together make a even more beautiful thing. And that's how I view it, is like that, say, leading is, the way I describe it in classes is like, leading is deciding where you and your partner are on the floor and basically supporting and responding to the ideas of your partner. And following is deciding how you get there and responding to your partner. And like, when I look at it through that lens, which was based on like Black gender dynamics that I saw out in the world, there stops being such a wide power gap. You stop needing to give space. You stop needing to it raises the bar for what is expected of the people in the lead role to be able to show up properly, and also to be able to show up in a way that supports their partner. But it also doesn't create the idea that the follower is just responsive. Because if there's anything that I've experienced through being at Muse and developing some of these classes, specifically the one on height dynamics and like body shaping this morning, is that followers have a lot more control than we actually give them credit for, in terms of how they can influence a dance in little intentional choices that is all within your agency. Now, if you choose not to take that, that is an option, but you have this much power, and the leaders have this much power, and together you have an amazing amount of power. But in this current system, I feel like because of some expectations around sequencing, like Jill and Dan are talking about, and some assumptions about what it means to be the powerful person based on words and gender norms and blah, 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 blah. You get this like strange dynamic where the leader has a lot of power and the follower doesn't have as much power, and the follower is supposed to wait for the leader to give more power. But in that, the leader is still always focused on the follower. They're never actually focused on their own expression, on their own dancing, on their own development. So the bar is actually much lower for them besides their ability to lead.
Yeah,
I wanted to add that, like, oh, do you want to go ahead, Dan?
It'll be quick. I'll just say that totally tracks with my experience because of my starting out in like Lindy Hop and blues, and like, which is having very white values. Like I would totally have I've experienced that power dynamic because I learned dance through these sort of classes that emphasize the lead things and all of that. So it kind of makes sense why we'd have that different impressions.
Thank you. I was thinking sort of like if we go through the context or like through the lens of it's a power dynamic, right? And we're bringing it back to the skill gap, right? If I am looking at it that the lead is here, and yet, so I'm kind of posing this out, if we are looking at truly that there is a power dynamic where the lead has all of the power and that the follow has less power, then why are we feeling like there is, you know, this gap in leadership skills of where the leaders can grow versus, you know, that we have the follows having, I don't know if I say there's higher skill sets versus that, though I think there is. Like there's a point where I feel like our leads are not matching what the follows are bringing to the table. My thought is like when I come into the dance as a follow, I definitely have an expectation that you like leads should be working on their skills too, so that we both can rise. And that to me is something that I've experienced in other dance styles and other Black dance styles of you need to keep working on your stuff consistently. So yeah, which layer do we want to like tackle that from?
I think you said a good point that really matters. As you were talking about the power dynamics of if you start here and you start here and everyone's trying to go for equal because no one wants to feel like a puppet, you have to work really hard to get here. But you don't have to work very hard to stay where you're at or to like go slightly above that. So like say if it's here and it goes slightly above that, you have to work this whole distance to be seen as an equal. And so it ends up being that you actually get significantly more like focused practice times, more skills, more like all of those things, because if you don't have those things, like you won't actually be able to be free to express yourself in your own dancing. You won't have as much agency in your own dancing. Like I know as a follow early on, that was the big thing that pushed me towards getting better, was I didn't want to feel like I didn't have control over anything that was happening to me anymore. I wanted to be able to express. I wanted to be able to have something to say. I wanted to be able to say, no, I don't want to do that turn. I don't want to be in that drop, and physically be able to signal that to my partner. Versus like as a leader, I've always felt that either my base is seen as enough and you should be kind of grateful for me leading you, is like there's a kind of dynamic there. And I think that's important to consider versus in my experience of like dancing with other Black dancers and even other Black styles, there's this assumption that we start off here and then we build together. So there's not that like gap that somebody's trying to race after the other person and then of course overtakes them, which is what I think might be happening. I don't know.
I saw like in the chat that somebody had talked about hijacking, and I wanted to like coming in with this mindset, if I bring myself and my agency into it, if I push stuff, that's not me taking over, right? There's a true difference of me hijacking, and I would consider like that me switching. When I actually switch into the role of a lead and I take over and I consistently lead, as compared to I establish and push my boundaries that thus causes the lead to have to shift, that's not hijacking to me, right? So hijacking to me is when I actually take over without consent, without like a negotiation of that's what we're going to do. But if I say I don't want to do something and it causes my lead to have to redirect, that to me is not hijacking. And I don't know how everybody else feels about that particular phrase, but I wanted to kind of add that in when I come in with my skills, my voice, my impression of things. It really is because I want to bring that dance up together, not from trying to equalize skills. Yeah, that's all I have to say on that one.
I wanted to add that people don't necessarily know what they don't know. And so I think sometimes when fellows do the kind of thing Katrina's talking about of adding things in, leads who may not be as familiar might see it as hijacking, but somebody who is more experienced might not. And there's another question in the chat about learning the other role. And I think it's really beneficial to learn the other dance role because it's one of the places where you learn what you didn't know. You find things that you never realized were an issue when you're trying to lead a follow that you didn't know when you were a follow, and vice versa. So I think that's a really important element to bringing everybody's dance level up, is to make sure that people have that kind of understanding so they start to see the places where their own skills can develop more strongly than they already are.
I have two quick thoughts. One of them, and they're on different sort of topics that were brought up. One of them was the hijacking topic. And I think for me, just as a lead, the way that I experienced the hijacking idea is like, I think that when people look for a very like precise, mechanically scientific answer is when it gets complicated. Because for me, when I feel like when people say hijack, I feel like I've been hijacked when I feel like I've been disrespected as a person in the dance, right? It's not about which momentum went what way or who started this direction. It's just about respecting the other person and making sure your ideas go with that person in the moment. And that's kind of all there is to it for me. So that's all I want to say about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the lead follow skill gap, in terms of like I feel like how do I put this? So I feel like leads aren't pushed to improve as hard as follows are pushed to improve. And I think that's kind of been mentioned throughout this already. But and like I think it was great it said it that like adequate is enough in a way, and there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. Like one, we have to take into account, right, North American, like largely North American white culture, which is men are like people with male bodies are really either shamed for dancing or very strongly not encouraged to dance. And this was my experience too. Like I've kind of always like enjoyed dancing around the kitchen, but I was sort of embarrassed and ashamed to dance until I found like swing dancing, which and blues dancing, which gave a very structured, like this is a cool way to do it. So I think there's that part. So it's really tricky to get people with like male bodies into the dance, and then when you combine that with the fact that there's all this pushing of female bodies toward following and male bodies toward leading, then you get like basically a lot fewer leads. And then with fewer leads, then like you're at a dance and there's a lot more follows and a lot fewer leads, and then so you just don't have to work that hard to get a dance, right? And so there's not that much competition, and like like it's been already said, there's such a difference between like expectations of white culture dancing versus like Black culture, like working on your dance. And so, yeah, I just feel like leads just don't feel like they have to work that hard. And so I don't feel like there's that group pushing to improve in the same way that I feel it follows experience it.
I think it's also that the skills that follows develop are not as visible. I mean, if you're familiar with the dance and knowledgeable about it, then you can see how followers are improving. But for dancers with less experience, may not find that as visible. And so I think that's also a problem for what you're talking about, Dan, of the leads not feeling that they're pushed to develop, but they don't see the way that followers are developing skills.
There was an interesting question in the chat about, are followers at all contributing to the skill gap, basically, is what it came down to. And that's not a thought I've ever had, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm a little curious on really anybody's thoughts, but also the, yes, also the, I'm so itchy, I have hives. But also what the other panelists or anyone else in this room thinks. So the immediate thought I had was, I know there's a very common practice of like fixing it. You know what I mean? When something goes a little wrong in a dance and you're like, I'll just adjust. I'll just like change it for them. I'll just, you know, and I know that sometimes when I get into a private lesson then with a leader, they get a rude awakening to realize that they've been doing that thing wrong, or they have not been as clear as they think they have been. And additionally, like, I think that by not taking all of your power, you are allowing the leaders to have your power, and that allows them to have ego. It allows them to think that adequate is enough, I think, in some ways. And I think that's like, I'm not sure in full how I think about that. Like, that's kind of a new thought. So like, you know, but I think that it's important to consider as a thought of like, if by us not taking on our full role, by either holding back or not expressing or being overly worried about hijacking in a way that is not what Dan was describing, it's like, that's not acceptable. But like, contributing to a dance is definitely within your bounds. But I've worked with follows before who don't do that for their partner's ego or for their partner's needs, or they think it's inappropriate for them to be doing that. And like, there's a lot of things that go into that, I think. But if I had to think of something that I think follows contribute to this problem with, that would probably be my thing.
Great, I'm going to interject here. I think it was you that brought up earlier that we've sort of overcorrected in terms of like how we teach follows. How does that tie into this idea that you're sharing now?
I think it's more of a structural, like, instructor problem and like an organizational problem of like, a lot of our classes haven't been focused on developing like leader body mechanics. They've worked on general expression for all dancers, and we've worked on follower agency, but still through the lens of leaders giving power, which I think is problematic for various reasons. But in essence, we don't really have a lot of space for leaders to learn that they fucked up, or that they didn't do it, or that they're not as good as they think they are, or that, you know, they think they're doing a fishtail, and I'm like, actually, no, you're not. This is not that thing. This is not that thing. You know, and I get that a lot in privates where people will come to me as leads and they'll say, I can't get this person to do this thing. And then I'll dance with them. I was like, oh, it's because you don't pulse. You don't do this thing. You haven't developed this skill. You don't know how to lag. So of course your partner can't lag. And like, because we focus more on expression or on like follower skills, we haven't, like, they don't know that they don't know it. It's kind of that weird intermediate problem that comes up a lot of like people get really, they're like, yeah, I'm an amazing dancer. And like, you don't want to break their heart because like, we're glad they're having fun and I'm so happy for you. And like, yay. And also, sweetheart, there's so much more to go. Like, you don't even know. And a lot of leaders get to that spot. And then because we correct for them and it doesn't come up in classes, and like, then there's the numbers game that Dan was talking about. So then people end up in open, and then like, it just kind of builds into this thing that a lot of leaders think they're the same skill level as follows because they're in the same classes, or because they've won a competition, or because they've been told that they're good, or because they're like, well, I've taken this class and I know how to do this thing and I know how to whatever. But there's never been a moment where they realize that, oh, my pulse is too small. My pulse is not strong enough. I don't actually know how to control tone very well, or whatever, what have you. And as follows, we often cover for that because we want to have a good dance, and nobody wants their partner to feel bad. And so it kind of just snowballs into this thing. And so that when I say like the overcorrection, I think that that's like specifically in class, like socially, you know, have your agency and do the thing. But in class, I think as instructors, we need to start shifting more towards the technical side of leading and following, and like how those things combine together. But also, if you're in class, not correcting for your leader, and like being willing to be like, hey, this pulsing thing isn't working. Like, let's find out if it's us together, or like if it's one of us is like, how do we dial in? And I hear that a lot about follows, particularly from leads who think it's their fault. And then come to find out as I dance with them, I'm like, oh no, actually this is on you, friend. This is on you.
There's one thing I really want to say around this idea of like is the follower like self-defeating kind of thing, all that. And it actually does tie in with what Diane wrote in the chat. And the short version of what I want to say is I don't want followers to feel like they need to handicap themselves to make the leads feel better about themselves. And it does tie in with what was brought up in the panel discussion previously, because I think that was really eye-opening for me, is like, yeah, we expect there's like an expectation for leaders, many leaders, especially in a like overly white community, like who have not done much dancing in their past, or don't really know how to move their bodies, or not comfortable with their bodies, are thrown into a class and expected to do this new move on a person and hope it works. And yeah, there's a bit of like, I felt that I've definitely apologized to people for not getting a move that I've seen twice and then was not able to lead it perfectly. So I feel that. So I feel like, I don't know, like it would be nice if there was some sort of revision to the system, where it's like you can get two people that work together, as opposed to trying to teach this person, like, and then that person tries to do it to another person. Like, it'd be nice if two people could kind of work together to figure out how things can happen as a unit, as a partnership, as opposed to lead does thing to follow. But the biggest thing I want to say is like that revision needs to happen to the system, as opposed to like follows handicapping themselves for the lead's sake. That's the biggest thing.
Oh, for sure. I really agree with that. Like, don't don't lose your sunshine just for for some lead. Like that's not what I was hoping to get across. But more so that, like, as an instructor, for example, I've shifted away from teaching movements as like this is a thing you do on another human, or this is a thing you feel being done to you, um, to more conversational. I know that there was a big taboo about like talking in partnership during a class, and I actively encourage it. And it's usually pretty awkward at first because nobody wants to say who's doing the wrong thing. And partly in my observations of kind of the average white American experience is that's kind of taboo, is to tell somebody that they've done something wrong. Uh, And one, that's not a black experience. They're just going to tell you to your face and make a joke about it, and that's just going to be what it is. And you kind of just got to let it roll off of you. But there's this timidness around having that conversation, around the follower being willing to say, "Hey, this didn't work out for me. Can we try that again?" But also for leaders who have that feeling of like, I didn't get it on the first time, so I must be terrible. Um, and then it like seeps out of them instead of being able to say like, okay, I think I'm getting this bit, but I'm not getting this bit. Like, what is happening? What's happening for you? And a good chunk of my classes are actually about learning how to communicate what's happening in your body and in your head with your partner while you're learning the material. And I found that to be really helpful for that. But also, it's just like, it's real. There's a lot of things at play here. And I think sometimes we oversimplify this conversation down to, oh, leads just need to do better. And it's like, there's a lot of like social norms and values and experiences and a lot of things all coming together to create this situation.
There is so much to this. I would just start off by saying that I know I have been, a culprit of adapting, right, to my leader, even when I know that they led something, especially in class, right, to save feels or whatever. And I've stopped. I've actively said I'm going to follow what was led, and obviously keeping in mind my own safety of things. But if I'm true to the idea that not only am I wanting to up my own skills of how do I adjust myself to stay within the fun, within whatever I'm learning and whatever that is, but also to, I'm going to say force, it's really not as harsh of a word as I want it to be, but sort of to like really bring forth that I'm following what you led, right? And we can then have a discussion about it if you like, and we can navigate whatever comes up in that way. Social dance floor versus classroom obviously has different skill sets in themselves about whether or not, whose role is it to give feedback, particularly in class, right? Is it the role of the instructor to only give feedback? Is it the role of the partnership? I personally am going to say it's both, right? My job as an instructor is to help guide and facilitate, but at the same time, you're the ones doing it. So I need to hear both sides to be able to say, well, what's happening? I will dance with both of you to kind of figure out what is happening. But I would love to have more actual conversations, and like Gray and in Dan, right? I also encourage that conversation and kind of guide people to like, how do you actually have conversation about this thing within it? The only way you're going to learn is if you're talking to each other about what happened. If it's my role as an instructor to only do that, then I can't help the follow in class, and I can't help the lead in class. With that, I also want to talk a little bit about that a lot of people, in terms of how they learned, we do have coming from both white culture and also Black culture learning, I have found that a lot of my white culture learning is about not hurting people's feelings. So I want to be really, really careful about how much I say no, because I want them to come back, as compared to actually instructing. And so I know for myself, you know, I'm a track and field coach, and I am very much around a good portion of Black individuals that coach, and there's a lot of no, right? And I work with a lot of white kids that don't understand how to hear no. And I don't mean no as in like if you go, did I do that right? No, right? They don't know how to hear that. So it's also, you know, a communication between how do I navigate and teach you something if you're not comfortable hearing me tell you you didn't do what I demonstrated this, you demonstrated this other thing, where there's a lot of just receiving feedback, not only from instructor, but let alone your partner within that. And so I think there's a lot of layers of even how do we bring that into, you know, personal development skills, right? And whose responsibility is that if you're coming into a learning environment? You know, what is your own due diligence as a follow and as a lead to come into learning how to navigate learning spaces and learning how to hear feedback and receive feedback and grow from feedback.
Maybe we could talk about this a bit more, because there's been some interesting comments in the chat about people who don't necessarily take feedback well, and again, I think then we get into gender dynamics and age dynamics and other kinds of power dynamics that can happen between the roles of
well, for sure,
leader and follower. And so thinking about how as teachers and as dancers, we can encourage people to see feedback as positive, even when it may be that people are being given things that they don't necessarily want to hear, or they didn't expect to hear, or whatever. But I think, you know, it's the only way as dancers that we get better is to get that kind of feedback from others. Feedback and practice, those are the things that make you better as a dancer. So finding ways to encourage that, I think, are really important if we're going to be in a position where followers feel comfortable about giving the feedback, but also about not necessarily doing what leads expect them to do just because leads expect them to do it.
All right, I think we're probably all reading the chat, which since there's been a lot of comments, but we have a couple more minutes. Does anyone want? I'm hearing a lot, and Jill, you did address this, and this kind of like toxic dynamic that can happen with the feedback. Does anyone want to comment on that in the last few minutes that we have?
Well, I do think, you know, and we've talked about power dynamics, and I think a lot of it is understanding where are you coming from your value sets, right? If you believe that if you have a very, you know, patriarchal idea or misogynistic idea of how to engage in relationships, well, then you're going to come from that mindset within that. If you come from, you know, teaching background where you're apt at having feedback, I think there's sort of there's a personal responsibility here in terms of how are we navigating conversations, and how are we, and then sort of like whose responsibility is that? Sort of, I'm kind of hearing like different things within that. Yes, I have had, you know, experience on the social dance floor and in class giving feedback, or if I did something wrong, that it's the immediate assumption that the follow was the wrong one who did it wrong, when in fact, you know, as you navigate further, you realize that the lead led something that caused me to do something else, right? So I know for myself, I have learned how to navigate those situations where I can either say, you know what, I don't feel comfortable learning with you, or we're not on the same page and I'm done with this dance, or I'm, you know, like like there is some level of like owning that for yourself, of saying this dynamic is not working for me and allowing me to grow in the way that I want to. It's no longer allowing me to be safe in the way that I feel comfortable. I can have that conversation. I can pull in third parties to help me navigate that conversation. I think if we're not calling out the behavior, then it doesn't change. And if we're expecting other people to change it without us calling it out, then it doesn't change. So like I said, what are we doing as our own selves within our learning spaces, within our social spaces, to hold not only ourselves accountable for our learning, but the learning around us in the way that feels good on everybody's part. Or I don't know if I want to say feels good, but like gets the result that we are hoping for.
I think one thing that makes me think of it, and something that's kind of been brought up in different ways in this, is because like kind of the flip side of that is that I've also heard like if anything goes wrong, like it's because the lead didn't lead it correctly, right? Like it's always the lead's fault. I've also heard that too, and the reason I say that is because I feel like there's a lot of really messed up dynamics that go along with criticism and blame and how that like the expectations and all. And I feel like more needs to be done. And I guess this is really good for me as a teacher, and a lot of us in this room are teachers or organizers or people that have an influence, because I think we can do more to set up the expectation in the classroom. And I think, Katrina, this is also something you were saying as well, is just set the expectation as someone who's managing the class, and say like, be prepared to hear things that we're going to work on this as a team or as a group. And hearing like ways to improve is a good thing, as opposed to a critique, or as opposed to pointing out ways that one person is inadequate at something. So I think that just things can change from the level of teachers and organizers to help that.
Okay, that is going to be our final official comment for this roundtable. We have about a 5-minute transition period. We're going to have folks joining back in from the lead roundtable for the wrap up. But Katrina, Gray, Jill, and Dan, you are welcome to keep discussing while folks join back in, since you don't have that transition period. But this is also a chance to, again, like grab water or whatever you need to do before we pick back up again in about 5 minutes.
I think I'm going to talk about a little bit about power and so my degree is in communication, and like specifically interpersonal and group communication. So if you've read any of my stuff, or you talk to me and I end up talking about that, or like get really meta, that's why. I'm really into people and how we function on our relationships and how we communicate the various things. I also have a very tragic backstory that involves a lot of power dynamics. So I feel like part of the issues that we typically run into in the community is that everyone is fighting for power, but doing it in an underhanded kind of way. And I think we can do better than that. And some of the ways to do that is to think about the way we phrase things and talk about not only each other, but ourselves, of like both sides have heard it's your fault. We're laying blame somewhere because there's a certain amount of shame. And if I didn't do this, well, I'm bad. And like, there's a certain amount of you blame other people to feel more powerful when you feel helpless. And it's this whole like complicated system of thought. But basically, the way to get out of it is to just go around it. There's like this whole like concept around anxiety where you can get in a loop for yourself, but if like your friend's like, hey, I really need this thing and I just can't do it, you're like, oh yeah, sure, I can do that. And that's like going around your personal anxiety. It gets you out of this spiral. And I think in ways, this is what we have to do to get around the like toxicity of dealing with critique and learning how to take it, one, not personally, two, not shameful, like assume shame is tied with it, but then also not project blame onto other people. And so like a thing that's been built into my classes is definitely like not only modeling this behavior, but encouraging people to participate in a healthy norm around it of like when someone says, oh, it's because you didn't do it. And I'm like, are you sure? Let's find out. Like, let's explore that. And it's like, well, there's this happening and there's this happening. And that's it. It's not about you didn't do this. It's not about I fucked up. It's just this is happening and this is happening. You're starting here, and you need to get here. How are we going to get from these two places to here? And it takes us out of that like egocentric space and into not only a collaborative space, but more of a just like, this is what's happening in reality of like, we were trying to strut together and we got some of this. So we know we got some of this. So what started happening? And you can start looking at it of like, oh, well, I slipped this 1 second. And so my pulse then started to shift. And it's like, well, what else happened? Well, if that person was like, well, I didn't adjust. And we're like, okay, so we now know we're doing some of this because there was a mistake, an accident that happened, and the other person didn't adjust. So what do you do next time? You adjust. And like, you try it again. And that's it. And it doesn't have to be this like terrible bad thing. Or like, if you're having feelings and you're like, this isn't working out for me, it's much less toxic to be like, hey, this thing isn't working for me. I'm not feeling comfortable. I don't think I'm getting enough pressure from you. Or like, I feel like I'm falling. And like, I language is of course a good choice, but also like, even if you don't know the answer to it, even just saying it can sometimes get you and your partnership to start working on it. I get a lot of students when they first try this out of like, they're like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know. I can't fix it. And it's like, it's not necessarily a fix. It's just like, my job is to help you fix it. Your job is to tell me what's happening in your body. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just like, what's going on? And people are like, yeah, I just feel like I don't have enough legs. And I'm like, oh, you feel like you don't have enough legs and you're dancing with somebody that's really tall. It's like, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, let's see what's happening. It's like, oh, hey, friend, your legs are really long. You gotta like manage those a bit more. And then they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then you try it again. And it's like, did that feel better? And they go, yes or no. And then you're like, okay, cool. What else is happening? And it just becomes this like, it's more curious than it is blamey or shamey. It's not about, well, you did this wrong and you don't know how to do this and you messed up this movement. And it's like, oh, that's not working between us. Why? It could be both of you. It could be neither of you. It could be the floor's too slick. It could be that it's cold outside and the moon's out and like everybody knows full moon is real. And that's all I got because Carolyn has a hand.
Thanks, Ray. I didn't actually want to cut you off, and I think everyone is finding this very interesting. And I want to that folks can actually leave at the end of this. So we're going to move back into our full group.